Hey everyone, Wes here. So in the last video we built out the web layer and data layer for our library application, and we completed our first migration. So in this video we're going to move forward and build out the beginning of our service layer and wire up our first controller and see it in action. So let's get started. Okay, so welcome to part 2 of our ASP .NET Core MVC Library Management System project. In the first part of this series, we defined our entity models and completed our first code-first migration of those models to create our SQL database. And so if you followed along for the first part of this series, you should now have a library data class library, which contains a folder for the migrations that we've run, and a folder for our entity models, and a file called librarycontext.cs, which contains our library context class, which inherits from Entity Framework Core's dbContext abstract base class. And this class contains a constructor that we can pass our context options to, and then a public DB set for each of the entity models that we have defined. So in our database, we'll have a table for each of our entity models, with the exception of the book and video classes, which inherit from the library asset abstract class. And because we're using the table per hierarchy inheritance model, in our database, we'll just have a single table for library assets, which will contain a discriminator defined by each of the concrete classes that inherit from library assets. So one flat library asset table, which will contain a column that will say video or book, depending on the asset type. And then a column for all of the properties that are on the library asset model, as well as a column for any additional properties that are on the concrete classes of book and video. So if you open up SQL Server Management Studio, and your connection string should be saved, but it should be localDB in parens and then / MS SQL localDB, and then just hit connect. And then look over in the Object Explorer on the left side of the screen and expand databases. And then we'll right click on library_dev, which is the database we're using in this project, and select new query. So we don't have any data populated in any of our tables yet, but we should still be able to query and get an empty result. So we can select star from library assets. And if you hit F5, that will run your query. And so you can see that we have a single ID column, and then we have columns for all the properties that are on our library asset class, including cost, image URL, location ID, number of copies, etc. And then we have this discriminator column, which will contain values of either video or book. And then we've got columns corresponding to the specific properties that are on those two concrete classes. So books will have an author, a Dewey index, and an ISBN, and videos will have a director. All right, so soon I'm actually going to provide some mock data that we'll insert into our database that we can use to develop against. But first, what I'd like to do is to now go back to the code. First thing I'd like to do is to set up our service layer. And so the service layer of our application is actually going to handle all of the interaction with the data that's in our database. So doing things like retrieving sets of data, retrieving particular instances of, say, a book or a patron, and then doing things like inserts, updates, or delete. So basic CRUD operations. So I'm just going to minimize everything in the library data class library and right click on the solution. And then we're going to click add, new project, and we're going to add another class library. So we'll just call this one library services. Say okay. Okay, and so our library services project here will represent our service layer for our application. So this is where sort of all of our business logic will take place, if you will. So any sort of interaction with the data that's in our database and the logic surrounding it will be implemented here. And since we'll need to be working with data that we have defined in our library data project, we need to right click on library services and add a reference. So we'll add a reference to library data and say okay. So the way that I'm going to set this particular project up is that this library services will have a set of classes here. For instance, we'll have a library asset service, we'll have a patron service, so we'll have services pertaining to any of the particular major areas of our application that require some business logic. And then each of the classes in our library services are actually going to implement an interface that I'm going to define in our data layer. So let's see how that would work with our first example. So I'm going to right click in library data. So we'll just add a class and select interface, and we'll call this one iLibraryAsset and click add. Okay, and the first thing that we should do is make this interface public. And so the purpose of this interface is to simply define the series of methods that will be required for any service that implements this interface. So the interface doesn't care about how any of the things defined in its signature happen. It just requires that they do happen, again, by anything that implements it. So for instance, for our library asset object, we would probably want a service that returns a collection of all of those assets. So we could call it GetAll, and I need to fix a typo and then import our models namespace. Okay, and we would also probably want to be able to return an individual instance of a library asset by ID. So we could define a method getById, and we'd pass that some ID value, which would correspond to the ID property on this particular library asset. And in our case, in other words, the primary key on the library asset table. And then we'd want a method to actually add a library asset to our data set. And then perhaps a series of other methods here. So for instance, if we want to get the author or director for a particular asset, if we want to get its Dewey call number, its type, so whether it's a video or a book in our case, its title or its ISBN. So then if you recall some of the other objects in our system, we may want to return the current location. So in other words, the current library branch associated with this asset. And yeah, we may in the future add other methods to our interface here that we will require to be implemented by any of the services that implement this interface. And feel free to add your own here. But I think probably good practice, although we've added a bunch of methods here up front, is to add methods as we design the system and kind of see what will be required of our service layer. For sure though, you would probably at least want methods where you're returning all the objects of this particular type, an individual instance of this type corresponding to its ID property, and the ability to add new objects of this type to your data set. So now I'm going to come down into our library services project, and I'm going to rename this class 1 that was created for us to library asset service. And then I'm just going to rename this to library asset service, and we'll make it public. Should then be able to implement our iLibrary asset interface. So that control period here and say using library data. And then we'll have an error that our interface is not implemented. So if you control period again and hit enter, it will implement our interface, or at least scaffold out each of the methods that we will be required to implement. And you'll see that for each of them, Visual Studio just provides a default not implemented exception. And so the way that this service layer is going to work is that we need to actually provide this class with a constructor that takes a DB context. And so first of all, we can save off that DB context into a private field. So we'll say private library context underscore context is what we'll call it. And so here's our private field to save that context. Now let's build the constructor for this class, and that will be public. And we need to pass that constructor our context. And then we can assign that private field. Okay, so this is great because now we have access to all of the methods that are on our DB context. And so now we can use it in methods to actually read or store or update data that is living in our database. So for instance, in our add method, we can simply call context.add, and we can add an instance of a new asset. And so Entity Framework is actually handling all of the sort of logic behind the scenes, saying, okay, this is an object of type library asset, so it belongs in our library asset table. And all we need to do is simply call this add method, which is available to us on our instance of our DB context. Next thing that we actually need to do though is call save changes. And so this is going to commit our changes to the database. And so you may consider doing something a little bit different with the way that you save changes. So for instance, if you were saving groups of assets or running other operations against your database, and you wanted to group those into a single transaction, you'd only want to call save changes once. So in that case, you might refactor to move save changes out of this add method, but for our purposes, it should work just fine. Okay, so now let's look at our GetAll method. This one is actually going to be pretty simple as well, because we can simply call context.libraryAssets and just return this. And so this is going to return a collection of our library assets, in fact all of them, from our database. And now there's something else we can call here called include. For this we need to actually bring in Entity Framework Core. So control period, and we'll bring this namespace into the class. And we can pass to include a function that will specify the additional entities that exist on navigation properties on this library asset class to include in our query results. So for instance, we may want to return the asset status, and we may also want to return the asset location anytime we call GetAll to pull back all of the library asset objects in our database. If we didn't call include here, then while the navigation property of status and location would exist on our set, it wouldn't be populated, so it would be null. But this way we are explicitly saying anytime you call GetAll and pull back all library assets, then include the status and location entities in your query result. Again, if we go back to the library asset class, we can see the library branch and the library status navigation properties. Okay, so I'm going to go back. And for now, I'm going to move this GetAuthorDirector method down a little bit lower in our class. And we'll come up to our GetID method, which is a little bit more of a straightforward query. So I'm going to remove this exception. And the way that this is going to work is we're going to simply return context.libraryAssets. And again, I'd like to include both the status and location in the results from this particular query. But now instead of returning all, I can say first or default. And to use first or default, we actually need to bring in system.link. And so this is a very small little link query here where we just will say if the asset ID is equal to the ID that we passed this method, then return the first or default instance where that's the case. So first or default will return null in our case because that's the default value of an object. Otherwise, it will return the first instance of that collection where this is the case. And we can be confident that there should be only one instance here where the asset ID is equal to the ID we passed this method, because this ID value corresponds to the primary key on the asset table. And so yeah, first or default is just a simple link method. You'll see it quite often when you're trying to return a single instance of something from a collection. So this is distinct from the first method, which you could also use, but in this case, if we call .first and nothing matches our query, we'll actually get a null reference exception here. So it would be safe to actually use first here as long as we were sure that the ID was going to match. But in any case, I prefer to use first or default in a lot of cases and just have this method return a null that we can then handle. All right, so let's look at a few more of these methods. So let's say we wanted to get the current location for an asset. As we go through the different methods in our service layer, I should note that this would be a really great place to get some practice using link. And you'll see a lot of repeated code here. So for instance, I could replace this return context.libraryAssets with GetAll and then .first or default. But I think it's useful, at least in a first go through our service layer here, to simply write out the method, if for no other reason than to just get some practice writing queries and trying to think through how you're going to return back the particular objects that you're looking for. And then once that's complete, and then theoretically once we have unit tests for each of these things, we should begin to refactor and reduce some of the repetition in our code. But again, for small classes like this, it's probably fine just to go ahead and start refactoring, or at least start optimizing a little bit early here. So for instance, calling GetAll here probably makes sense. Okay, so our GetCurrentLocation method. So let's return context.libraryAssets.firstOrDefault, where the asset ID is equal to the ID that we passed this method. And then we simply need to get the location on that object. So again, this could be refactored into just saying return get by ID and passing it the ID and then getting the location. So a lot of these methods you'll see just end up being really small, maybe not even really necessary to be honest, depending on the granularity that you would require. But syntactically, sometimes I do like to have methods that just explicitly say what they're doing at the expense of having a slightly larger number of very small functions that are in our service layer. So again, a matter of personal preference, but for our purposes, it'll also just give us a little bit of practice here, getting comfortable with retrieving data from our database and just kind of seeing how that all works. So let's think about this GetDeweyIndex method. So this might seem simple at first, but if you recall, we have a database structure where we have this discriminator column on our library assets table, and we'll have some books and we'll have some videos. And the way that we have our classes set up, if we go back into our models here and look at our book model, our book is what contains a Dewey index. And so the abstract library asset class doesn't contain a Dewey index, nor does the video class, just our book class. And so in our service, let's write a simple method such that we only return the Dewey index when this ID corresponds to an asset of type book. And there are a number of different ways we could do this. We may come back and refactor, but for now, let's simply write it this way. We'll say if context.books. Remember, we still have access to the collection of assets that are books. And then we'll call .any, and we'll just write a little lambda here. We say book.id is equal to ID. Then we'll return context.books firstOrDefault, where the book ID is equal to the ID that we passed this function, .DeweyIndex. Otherwise, we'll return an empty string. And since our Dewey index here is going to be used primarily in a view where we're going to show, say, the Dewey call number for a particular book in a listing, if we have, say, a column and a table for that, where we include rows for both books and videos, any books that have an ID that we pass this function will return the Dewey index there. So videos will have an ID in our assets table that will not satisfy this condition. And so in that case, we'll return an empty string. One of the other ways that you can write methods that implement sort of the same functionality is using something called the OfType method. So for instance, if something is a book, you can say context.libraryassets.oftype and then book object. So you might be able to work a function like this into one of your methods, and maybe we'll look at that in a little bit as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and make my text a little bit bigger here, and then just clean up some of the way that this looks a little bit. Come up here. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. We'll do something very similar for our GetISBN method here. So in this case, again, if any books match the ID that we pass this function, then return that book's ISBN number, otherwise return an empty string. Again, another opportunity to refactor this function here because we're repeating ourselves. GetTitle, another very straightforward and ultra thin wrapper where we're just returning the first or default asset whose ID corresponds to the ID we passed this method, and then grabbing the title off of that object. And let's come down to this GetAuthorDirector method now. And the way that I'll write this, I'll actually implement that OfType method that I just mentioned earlier. We'll say if something is a book, which we'll define by saying context.libraryassets of type book, where the asset ID is equal to the ID that we passed this function, .any. And then we'll store another value and say if it is video, where the library assets are of type video. Now in our case, I realize that we only have two asset types, either book or video. The way I'm going to construct this method will be in such a way that, let's say we include magazines at some point among the types of assets that we control that will explicitly have a bool for each of those types. So in other words, I realize that anything that is not a book in our system is a video. And so in our particular case, I probably don't need to define an is video. But as I said, if we include other types at some point, then we don't have this simple either is a book or is a video. We may have something like is a magazine. And so what I'll do is I'll just say return is book, and then I'm going to use the ternary operator here where I'll say if is a book is satisfied, in other words, if the ID that gets passed to this method corresponds to an asset of type book, then I'm going to return context.books.firstOrDefault .id is equal to ID .author, which exists again on our books collection. Otherwise, return context.videos.firstOrDefault video.id is equal to id.director. And if for some reason neither of these become satisfied and I would be returning null, I can then use like a null coalescing operator here and just say unknown. This is a little verbose and maybe not the easiest code to follow if you came across it for the first time. So it'd be a good candidate for a refactor, this entire method. But in short, what we're saying that is if the ID that we pass this method corresponds to a book, we store that as the case. Otherwise, if it is a video, we store that as the case. And then we say, okay, if it's a book, get me the author that's on the book that corresponds to this ID. Otherwise, get me the director that corresponds to the video. Otherwise, just return a string unknown. And lastly, let's visit our GetType method here. And by getType, I mean get asset type. So in our case, either book or video. And we'll keep this one kind of simple. And again, like many of these methods, there may be a better way to refactor this in the future. So for now, we'll say we have a book, which will correspond to our library assets of type book, where book ID is equal to the ID that we passed the method again. And I need to name my lambda variable something other than book here because I am using it as a variable name here. And what I'll say here is return book.any, which will return true if this query returns a book. So I'll say return a book in that case, otherwise return video. So personally, I think this is a little bit hacky and will be a good opportunity for us to refactor. We're hard coding the discriminator names in here and we're using a ternary, but we'll come back to this in a little bit. In any case, this should work for us to determine whether or not the ID of an object that we pass this GetType method is a book or is a video. All right, so now that we have the first part of our service layer, so we have a library asset service class, which implements our library asset interface, let's see how we can use this service inside of one of our controllers. So that's going to be in the web layer. So what I'm going to do is just minimize our data and services projects. And then up in our library project, which is our MVC application, we're going to expand controllers. And you'll see that we have this home controller built for us by default because we use the ASP.NET MVC template. And you'll see again that we have our controller actions defined here. So for the home controller, we have an index, about, contact, and error message defined. You'll see that the home controller extends the controller abstract base class that's part of the MVC framework. And you'll see that these actions here are indeed very simple. So in most cases, we're just returning a view. And in some cases here, we have some view data as well. We'll come back to the home controller towards the end of the application as we're bringing all areas of the application together. And for now, we'll work on something a bit more interesting, which will be our catalog controller, which is going to use our library asset service that we were just working on in the services layer. So under controllers, I'm going to right click and we're going to add, and you can actually add a new controller. I'm going to opt to just add a new class here and we'll build it up from scratch. So we do need to name this something controller, so let's call it catalog controller. And you'll just want to take note with the name of your controller because this will be used in the URL. So we'll have like our application / catalog and then / some action result that we'll define inside of our catalog controller. So I'm going to go ahead and add this. So what we need to do first is inherit from the controller base class. And we'll control period here and bring in MVC. And so as briefly discussed in the first video in this series, Microsoft's ASP.NET Core MVC takes its name from the actual design pattern, also abbreviated as MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. And so what we'll be working on first here is a controller. And the purpose of the controller is to handle all the data that might come back from our data source and work with it to push it into a particular view model that we'll use to then display in a view. So in a moment here, we're actually going to create a new folder called models. And this is going to be different from the models that we defined in our data layer. So our models in our data layer are what you might call entity models or domain models, if you will. And they'll map directly to objects in our database. So they'll map directly to tables in our case, in our database. The models in our MVC layer, so the models in our web layer, are more like view models, and they actually just represent data that we are going to want to show to the user inside of a view. So those values might be calculated using any number of different models that come back from our service layer, and in fact may not necessarily correspond to any of our entity models at all. So for instance, if a page for some reason showed like the current date, we would have a date time property in our view model to store that current date, but that wouldn't be necessarily something we track among our entities that are in our database. So we'll take a look at this in more detail as we build out this first controller. And the way this is going to work is we're actually going to create a constructor here. So we're going to call it public catalog controller. And we're going to pass our constructor our iLibrary asset interface. And we'll create a private iLibrary asset to save off that instance, and control period here to make sure that we're using our library data project. And I'm going to control period here up in our using statements to clean them up a little bit. And then inside of our constructor, I just need to save the assets param off into a private field so that we have access to it in the rest of the controller here. So say assets equal to assets. Okay, so let's create our first controller action. So as you may have noted from the home controller, we're going to return an action result. And we're going to specify an index action. So this action is going to actually get hit when we visit the root URL of our website /catalog. And I think that that page should basically just return a list of our entire catalog. We won't worry just yet about doing any kind of asynchronous loading from the database, which would be something you definitely want to do if you have a very large collection that you need to return to a page. In our case, to get the application running, let's just actually return everything that we have in our collection of library assets from the database. So let's store that off into a new var, and we'll say AssetModels is equal to our assets. If you recall, we have a GetAll method implemented by our iLibrary asset interface. But I don't actually want to return this set of domain entities back to the view here. I could just return this set of library assets back to the page. But what I would like to do instead is to select those into a custom view model that I'll create now. This again will allow us to sort of separate our concerns between the data that we're storing for functional purposes, if you will, in our database with what we explicitly would like to show to the user. And so we'll have that sort of abstraction on top of our entity models here, which will comprise our view models. So let's go ahead and right click on library, and I'm going to add a new folder, and we're going to call it models. And then in here, I'm actually also going to create a new folder, and we'll call it catalog. And let's create a new file, and it's going to be a class, and it's going to be called our AssetIndex listing model. And so like our domain models, this is also going to be a POCO class. But unlike our domain models, we don't necessarily care whether or not this actually maps to how any particular data is represented on our backend, but rather how the data is going to be represented on the front end. So I know at least I'm going to need an ID, so I'll need to work with the ID of a particular asset in order to create, say, like a detail page, or to get any other particular information about that particular asset. We'll have the image URL, which again we can get from our domain model, and we can get much of this from our domain model without much data manipulation. We have a title, author or director type, say Dewey call number, number of copies, and we'll leave it at that for now. If there's anything else that we'd like to include, we will come back to our view model here and define a property to store its particular value. So let's go back to our catalog controller and let's store a new var here, and we'll call it our listing result. And we'll use the asset model, so this is getting all the data that's coming back from our database. And now we're going to use a link select function. So we need to control period and bring in link. And select, all it does is it's actually probably one of the most powerful aspects of link, is that we're now going to actually project all the elements of our asset model's result here that we got back from the database into a new form, so into any type of other object that we might want to map it to. And so we'll do that using an anonymous function here. So we'll call it result, and we're going to create a new AssetIndex listing model. So we're going to map it into this model that we just created. So control period and bring in that namespace. And so this is going to actually map every element that's in the collection of asset models into a new AssetIndex listing model via this function. And so most of the mappings here are just going to be sort of, direct, sort of one-to-one here. So we'll say the ID for each of these is going to be equal to the ID from the result that we got back from the database for each element. Image URL is equal to result.image URL. And then I'm just going to scroll down here. The author or director. And to get this, we're actually going to implement the get author or director function that we wrote in our service layer. So we'll say assets.getAuthor or director, and all we need to do is just pass it the result.id. The Dewey call number, again, we wrote a function for that. The title is just going to be the result.title. Type, we will use our GetType function. Okay, and that should take care of selecting our results into our custom view model here. But what I would like to do is to actually contain this listing model inside of an index model, in case there's anything else inside of this index view here that we would like to represent outside of just the simple collection of assets that we have. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and inside of our models folder, again in our web project, and just to avoid any confusion, I'm going to go ahead and minimize our other projects here. Inside of our catalog folder, I'm going to add a new class, which we'll call AssetIndex model. And this is going to be an ultra simple model. It's actually currently just going to wrap a collection of our AssetIndex listing model. Again, using the MVC pattern, we could just pass this collection directly down to the view, but I like the idea of having a page model for every page and then a particular model for each sort of component, if you will, inside of that page view model. Even if it is just one property here, in many cases we'll have pages that will have things other than a list here, and so to maintain some sort of consistency across our framework, occasionally I'll have models here which actually just wrap a single collection of other models. So it keeps things consistent and modular even if our models here are extremely lightweight. Go ahead and remove unnecessary usings and we'll save this. And then so we come back to our catalog controller and let's go ahead and pass a new instance of our AssetIndex model where the only property on it, which is our assets, is equal to our listing result that we just created. We're going to pass that to our view. So we'll return view, and you can actually just directly pass the model that you'd like to return to the view inside of the view method here. And so now we're actually 2/3 of the way through implementing the MVC pattern for our first controller action. I'm just going to go ahead and save this. And so now let's create our first view. So you'll note that under the views folder here, we already have a folder for home views that was created by the template. So what I'll do, just like we did for models, is I'm going to right click on views and add a new folder called catalog. And I'm going to right click again and again add a new item. So we'll select view page and we're just going to call this index.cshtml, and it's alright that we already have another index.cshtml, but just note that that's in the home directory. This is relative to our catalog directory. So you'll note that we get this templated CSHTML file out with a comment at the top here and then an empty razor object here. I'm just going to go ahead and actually delete all of that. And at the top of each of our views, the way this is going to work is we're going to have this @model directive defined at the top of all of these files, and we're going to point it to the view model that we would like to pass to this view. So in our cases, it'll be found under library.models.catalog.AssetIndex model. And as I was saying before, you could actually pass it the collection of AssetIndex listing models. So we could say the model is equal to enumerable of our listing models. And this would work too, especially for sort of a simple listing page like we have. And so this is what I meant by choosing what we pass down to our views. But for our cases, again, to maintain consistency with the way that I like to set up our project here, I'm just going to actually pass it this lightweight asset index model, which contains that collection of asset index listings. Okay, and then the other thing I'll show you here, although this isn't something that I find particularly useful, is that if we do @ and then curly braces here, we can define something on viewBag. And so this allows us to dynamically generate things, properties that are on this viewBag object. So for instance, we can define a viewBag title and say, call it library catalog index. And so we could use this inside of our HTML sort of dynamically. So if we had like a h1 tag here and we said at viewBag.title, this would show library catalog index. I don't find it particularly useful because I like to think that I could pass anything into this view, just construct it actually in the controller rather than sort of define new variables here, if you will, inside of the view itself. We're just going to remove it for now. And I'm going to type out this HTML here fairly quickly, and then for future views, I'm going to do more copy and pasting and then just do quick reviews of what HTML is going into the page, because I think the focus of this particular series is more on developing an MVC application using services and not so much on constructing HTML. Towards the end of the tutorial, though, we will look more closely at some front-end stuff. So we will be looking at the data tables JavaScript library, as well as material design and Bootstrap. But for now, just bear with me as I type out some of this HTML rather quickly. So this page will essentially consist of one div that we'll call assets, and we'll put a heading here. Use the Bootstrap table and table condensed classes. And then we'll have columns for our image, title, author or director, and the Dewey call number. And then the table body here is where things get a little bit more interesting. And so we're going to use razor syntax here to dynamically generate each row of our table, which should correspond to each instance of an index listing model that comes back in our asset index model. So let's see what that would look like. So first of all, since we're using razor, we know we need to use spiral, and then we can basically write some C#. So I can say for each var asset in, I have access to this model through @M_model.assets, which is the only property on it. And I'm going to create a new row. For each of those assets. And so this first cell is actually going to contain the image. And so what I'll do is I'll just have an image tag here, say image source is equal to @asset.imageURL. So you can see how we are accessing properties on each instance of our listing object here. And we're going to use that to dynamically generate the HTML that we're building out for this page. And I'm going to create a custom class for that. And then I'm going to create cells each for the asset title, asset author or director, and the Dewey call number. Okay, and then I'm going to close off the remaining div here. And now let's look at one more type of helper that's actually available to us with the .NET Core MVC framework. We have these sort of tag helpers that we can use, similar to the Razor syntax with a spiral, except that we can actually do some HTML style helpers with a special syntax. So say we want to create a link here. I can actually say ASP controller is equal to catalog, so I can specify a controller and an action. So ASP action is equal to detail. I'm going to create a detail action in our catalog controller. And then I just specify a route, so I can say ASP route ID is equal to, scoot this over, at asset.id. And then I'm going to tuck this image tag inside of our link. And so you might be wondering, now that we have created a controller and a view and a view model for our catalog, at least our catalog index action, how will our application know how to implement the methods that are defined on this interface? So if you recall, we handled all of the getting of our data and setting of our data inside of this asset service. And so in order to inject this service into the catalog controller, when it asks for methods like GetAll or GetAuthorDirector, we actually need to add it back in our startup class to our configure services method. So if we scroll down and look for our configure services method, note that we already had add MVC as part of the template, and we already had add DB context, which we added ourselves to make sure that we're connecting to the SQL database that we are working with. What I'm going to do here is to actually, first of all, I'd like to add a singleton instance of our configuration, but we're actually going to be calling add scoped with iLibrary asset and our library asset service, for which we need to add a reference. And so what will happen now is that our library asset service is going to get injected into our catalog controller anytime it is requesting our library asset interface. And so this is a great example of how the framework is leveraging the concept of dependency injection. So with that, we actually have a completely wired up MVC pattern here, where our controller is going to be using, in a sense, the service that we set up to pull back a collection of library assets that it's going to select into a particular view model that it's going to then get passed to the view and show the user. So if we have some data in our database, we should actually be able to visit the root URL of our application /catalog/index and see a table of all of the assets that are stored in our database. So what I'm going to do now is open up SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to run a script to populate some mock data for us to work with. So you can see this SQL script here. I'll provide a link to this script in the description below. Of course, you could write your own if you want to include your own custom data in your application. I have tried to represent the data in a fairly accurate form. I think it makes it easier to debug and to develop on if you have some data that's fairly representative of what you would see in an eventual QA or production style environment. So very quickly, I have 3 library branches that are getting inserted, a set of library cards and library patrons, some static data here, so our statuses, of which I've defined 4, so checked out, available, lost, or on hold. Okay, and then I have a collection of library assets, so lots of different books and videos here. Finally, I have a set of branch hours, so you'll note that for each of the 3 branches in the system, I'm going to define an integer value for each day of the week, and then a close and an open time for that particular day for that branch. All right, so as I said, you can see the link below in the description if you want this exact data set. Otherwise, feel free to insert your own data to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And so now if you hit F5 in SQL Server Management Studio, that's just going to execute the current script in your editor. And so you can see that we have a set of data here for all of the various different tables in our database. I didn't include an image URL yet in the database. It looks like I forgot a telephone number for the patrons. We can go back and add those later. For now, the main table we're concerned with, and the one we're working on with our MVC pattern right now, is this assets table. So now that we have data here, we should be able to fire up the application and actually see something in our catalog index view. So I'm just going to go back to the code, and we're going to fire up IIS Express. And so after just a moment, we should see Chrome open. And you can see that we still have the default template that was brought in with our MVC template. But what we can do now, and we'll remove all this soon, but for now we're working on the catalog controller. So I should be able to visit /catalog. Saying /index is optional here since it's the default method on this controller. We'll hit enter, and you can see that we now have a table with data that's getting populated from our database. And so that's great. And actually, just to confirm that, we can actually look, let's say we'll look for this title Emma by Jane Austen with this call number 823123, and if we update that, come here, create a new query, we can do something like update library assets set Dewey index is equal to, let's just say 823.111, where title is equal to Emma. And if we run this, one row is affected. If we go back to our application and just reload, we'll see that the Dewey call number is updated. So our application is talking to our database, which is fantastic. You can see that we don't have images yet in our application for any of the titles. So let's go ahead and add those. So I'm going to go just back into our code here. And if you recall, in the first video in this series, I talked about this www root directory that is inside of our library project. So this is where our static files get served up. So if we look under images here, these SVG banner images actually just came in with a template. But the insert that I ran earlier gave a path for image URLs for each of our library assets here. And you can see that the string here is just a relative path. So this is actually going to be inside the www root directory. And then directly in there, I just have a set of images with the name of each of the books. And so I'm just going to drop those images here. First, we actually need to stop our application actually. And then I'm going to drag the images that I've saved here into the images directory. Okay, so I've just dropped all of the book cover images into this images directory. And so I'm going to go ahead and fire the application back up. Okay, so it's starting. And so now if we go to /catalog again, we don't have any CSS styling applied yet, but we can see that our images are loading. And of course, they're just rather large. So this will be something that we'll handle in our CSS. So this is starting to kind of come together. What's nice now is that we have proven that we can talk to our database. We can serve up static files, and we can implement the MVC pattern by injecting a service into our controller and pushing that data into a ViewModel that then gets pushed into this HTML view that gets viewed by our users. Also, just as a side note, I mocked up each of these covers myself, so there should be no concerns with using them to demo this application. So the next parts of the video will actually be moving a little bit quicker. It took a little bit more time here because this was the first time in the application where we implemented MVC and where we brought everything together with our service layer, our data layer, and our web layer. So yeah, we'll be moving a little bit more quickly in the next video, but we will implement our detail page and then start creating out the other areas of our application. So for patrons, branches, and wiring up the logic to handle our checkout system and hold system. So stay tuned for the next part of the series. Thanks.